radical left has taken over the Democratic Party.
Hello and welcome to Think Progressively, covering politics and all the other chaos life has to offer. This is episode 7, recorded on Sunday, September 27th from Milwaukee. I'm Joe.
And I'm Dan.
We have a special guest today. Jason couldn't make it. I launched him out of a cannon, so we have Dan here instead. How you doing, man?
I'm doing good. It's really nice to see you.
Good. And on today's episode, we'll be discussing the new Netflix documentary that's gained quite a little bit of popularity recently, The Social Dilemma. But first, the headlines.
Fake news.
Fake news.
Fake, disgusting news.
Up first in headlines, Kentucky grand jury indicts one of 3 officers in Breonna Taylor case, none of which are for the murder of Breonna Taylor. I don't know what to really think about this. You could say lack of justice is a real conclusion here, but
it's disappointing.
Right. Officer Brett Hankinson, who was terminated in June, has been charged with 3 counts of wanton endangerment over shooting into neighboring apartments, and his bond is currently set to $15,000. The other 2 officers were found to have no wrongdoing for their actions and found that they were justified in using their use of force, basically.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of nuance to this Breonna Taylor case. I know Jason and I said that we were going to do a deep dive into Breonna Taylor later on. But I don't know. The idea that once again we see officers endangering citizens of people. And I mean, this was literally, in Kentucky, a right to protect yourself state, the Castle Doctrine state, right?
Exactly.
So it's, of course, you don't see anything from like the actual NRA crowd, though, which is just infuriating. I mean, if this was like a white guy, you'd see them. Well, no, you don't even see that crap either, because you do see cases with white people actually having guns, interacting with the police. And they're getting shot too, even though they're completely innocent, but they were just trying to defend themselves because they didn't know what the situation was. I think there was like a case in Arizona where a guy had a noise complaint called on him in the middle of the night. Cops knock on his door. He didn't know who it was. And he comes out with a pistol and they shoot him within like 5 seconds. I don't know what to do with these.
Yeah. It's already the case that black people have reason to mistrust the police or fear the police. And so even if they knew that it was the police barging into their home in the middle of the night, like, I get why they'd respond that way, or why her boyfriend would respond that way. But my understanding is he didn't even know it was the police.
Correct. So when you have officers coming in plain clothes, trying to, again, there's a lot of nuance to where they were initially given a warrant for a no-knock warrant, but they still knocked anyway, according to witnesses. But even then, there was still confusion about who they actually were. And Breonna Taylor's boyfriend thought that he was defending himself from a home intruder.
Right.
I'm even okay with saying that obviously this isn't a situation with racist cops trying to kill a black person. I'm okay with that. But when you have a situation that's set up for failure like this, something needs to change. Otherwise, we're just going to have this happen over and over and over again.
Right.
And what infuriates me is you see the Black Lives Matter crowd standing up for stuff like this. Yet you're seeing absolutely nothing other than excuses being made. I mean, I'm seeing tons of people saying how Breonna Taylor deserved to die, which is infuriating and sickening.
Yeah, that's painful.
But why? Like, why would they not also want police reform either?
Right, yeah. What if they're the innocent person that gets shot next time? I mean, let's have a little compassion for people across the board and try to see ourselves in them.
Right. And I think, it goes back again. I know I quoted this a little bit earlier or from a previous episode, but the idea of like dying of whiteness is a real problem we have in America, where you have white people who are so hell-bent on making other people pay for supposed crimes that they commit, or they want people to suffer for things, especially black people, that they're actually putting themselves in danger because of it.
Right.
And that's the big issue here. So we'll definitely have to talk about this more in detail later. But this is really a tragic ending to the whole situation here.
In other news, Trump refuses to commit to peaceful transfer of power.
Hooray! Just when you can't think there's like any lower bar for this guy to go. So first thing I have to ask, Dan, do you think this is intentional, or do you think it's just him being stupid?
It's so hard to know what's going on inside his mind. There's people that think that he's some kind of political genius, that it's all careful and calculated, but I just don't know. It might just be pure ego, and him being unwilling to even consider the possibility that he could be legitimately voted out. So if the results aren't what he thinks they should be, it has to be fraud, or has to be some kind of problem with ballots.
Well, I mean, let's get into what he actually said here. So during a press conference, President Trump was questioned about whether or not he was going to transition peacefully or transition power peacefully, win, lose, or draw. And that was the idea. The reporter was talking about how people are rioting and people are very tense right now. And just to move our country forward, are you willing to commit to that peaceful transition? His response was, well, we're going to have to see what happens.
Here, I got the transcript. Reading a Trump transcript is always a lot of fun.
I mean, usually like transcripts in general may make everyone look stupid, but just in general, like reading Trump's transcripts are just like, I don't even know. You lose brain cells immediately trying to.
It's
figure
totally
out.
incoherent. Without his voice inflection, it's almost impossible to follow.
Right.
So, okay, let's just try reading it straightforward here. We'll want to get rid of the ballots, and you'll have we'll have a very peaceful. There won't be a transfer, frankly. There'll be a continuation. So in other words,
Good God. And let's be real here. His inflection doesn't make it any better either.
no, it's terrifying. Really, it is. He was starting to say, if we do it properly, there will be a peaceful transference of power. I mean, any other president would have said, if we have an honest election and the American people make their choice, and I'm not the one that's chosen, there will be a peaceful transference of power.
Well, and that's where you see like Republicans, including Mitch McConnell, immediately jump on and say, oh, no. We're going to have a peaceful transfer of power here. So here's my main concern. A lot of the media is worried about, because, I mean, this is really bad to have a president say. Like, I'm not going to deny that. And of course, it leads down to various rabbit holes about whether or not we are going to actually lead to like some weird, Trump's not going to leave office, the situation. He has to get dragged out of office. That's not my main concern. My main concern is actually his followers. Where
Absolutely.
when push comes to shove, Trump's going to leave, like the little cowardly puppy he is. However, I think that when you have an election coming up like this, that's going to be so tense, and people don't understand that this is going to be an election unlike any other, because we're going to have votes coming in almost a week later sometimes, and this is going to take a long time to get those ballots in. If we have an early showing that Trump is leading, and then all of a sudden a mass flux of mail-in ballots, which are shown to be more predominantly Democrat voters right now, because Democrat voters are the ones who are taking COVID-19 more seriously.
Right.
He's going to cast doubt on those legitimacy, or on those results, basically.
I mean, he already has.
Right.
He's primed his base to interpret that scenario as fraud.
Correct. And that's what scares me, where the idea of having this grand conspiracy, and we've talked about, or at least Jason and I have talked about QAnon and stuff before, and various conspiracy theorists. This could very well be like the straw that breaks the camel's back for a lot of people.
I agree.
A really good reason to have someone take up their guns and say, nope, I'm going to start charging Washington, or, take assault on something, because our country is officially broken in by their way, and they're trying to take my guy out of office by some weird secret deep state thing.
And I feel like we all get that, and that reporter was trying to get Trump to get it too. Like,
Right.
This is your opportunity to de-escalate things a little bit in our country, and Trump just can't do it.
Right. Well, I mean, he was like practically pleading with the guy in
Yeah.
where he's like, but Mr. President, like, people are rioting. Can you please just
Yeah.
do this? Or he's like, no. And this is basic cult manipulation 101. And that's kind of what I've noticed as well, where when you get challenged, or when a cult leader gets challenged on anything, their first response is to immediately deflect, to immediately cast doubt on what the question is, or to gaslight, right? And then to throw accusations at an enemy.
Yep.
If it's unfalsifiable, that's better, because then you have people who are causing more mass confusion because they don't know who the enemy actually is. And that's the idea with the deep state, or the Democrats, where they know who to kind of point the finger at, but they don't exactly know how anything's happening, and they can't be disproven as easily. And that's what scares me for a lot of people, because when you already have a constituency that's very similar to a cult already, this is what escalates that type of situation.
Absolutely. And you can see that's why the White House is refusing to just outright condemn QAnon. They're useful idiots.
Right. So we'll see what happens with this. I have no idea, and it just scares the living hell out of me. And last, and certainly least, Trump officially nominated Judge Amy Coney Barrett for the Supreme Court. We already talked about Amy's record last time, so we won't go too much into that. But I don't know. It's news, but at the same time, it's like not shocking either. Trump picks the leading crazy right-wing constituent or right-wing judge that we were already going to have.
Naturally.
So it's just the big question now is how fast this process is going to be. Are we actually going to have a justice confirmed by the Senate, which I believe, if I remember correctly, Lindsey Graham said he wanted to have it by, I think, in like 3 weeks. He wants the justice confirmed, which is pretty freaking fast. So we'll see what happens with that. I think the big thing we need to take away, though, is don't get sucked into their talking points. Don't get caught up in the hysteria of the Supreme Court battle, I guess you can say. We can have Amy Coney Barrett try to testify. We can question the hell out of her. Maybe we'll have some clips that can piss some people off, but I think we should make this as downplayed as possible and stick to the issues of COVID and things like that right before the election, things that actually upset people and motivate them to vote. I don't know. What do you think?
No, I agree.
There was some talk about Democrats boycotting this hearing. I don't know if that's a good idea. Where I think if you have a mass boycott of it, sure, it could send a message. Great. I mean, but it's the message people already know. Usually when people think about this whole Supreme Court pick, the first thing they think about is, oh yeah, Republicans already said this back in 2016. Now they're contradicting themselves. Like, that's already the main story. If you have the Democrats who are not going to actually obstruct what's going on, but they're just going to make a show out of it, I think you're going to get some bad both sides are equal thing here, where it's like, well, both sides are bad and are not doing anything, so I don't care type of stuff. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm so tired of that.
Right. So I think if you just go with the procedures, stall as much as you can, make the process long and drawn out, that's totally fine. But don't turn this into the spectacle right before the election. I think that's the best thing to do. And as much as I hate to say it, get ready for Justice Amy Coney Barrett, whether we like it or not.
Yep,
we'll now have a 6-3 conservative majority, like hard conservative majority on the court for the next 40 years.
Ugh.
Yeah.
Well, that took a dark turn.
But I mean, and that's, I guess you can call the segment like elections still have consequences. So freaking vote.
Right.
Just freaking vote.
Left wing. We're going left wing all the way.
So, Dan, this documentary,
Yes, sir.
what are your thoughts on it?
Well, I have lots of thoughts.
I don't even know where to start. So The Social Dilemma, which is a new documentary on Netflix, it's currently one of the trending things on Netflix right now, and it's kind of making its rounds all over the internet. It's about how social media is influencing us and kind of leading to more negative outcomes, and basically it's stuff you kind of heard before, I have to say. It just kind of puts a good detailed spin on it.
So I don't know. I think you and I have heard stuff about it before, but I don't know that the general public is aware of it. So I'm really glad that they made the documentary to bring it into public awareness more. And even I learned quite a bit from it. I mean, understanding how these algorithms work and how specialized they are for each of us, and the way that's designed to push you further down a rabbit hole that's all about holding your attention.
Right. I mean, and they clearly showing a great job of how there are actually 3 men inside my phone currently telling me what to do. Okay, so I think before we even get to the substance of it, we have to talk about the dramatization.
Yes.
Because I can't handle it.
So here's what I saw when I watched it. I was raised Jehovah's Witness, and I no longer am. So when I see things that remind me of it, it can be a little bit annoying. But it reminded me of a dramatization that I would have seen on like jw.org or whatever
Sure.
their current website is. And I've heard other people talk about it looking a little bit like an after-school special.
Like a
and
really bad after school special
Yeah,
or
yeah.
something. Yeah.
So, I mean, I totally get that. And we watched it. I've watched it twice now. I watched it once myself, and then I watched it again with the whole family, including 4 kids ranging from 16 down to 9 years old. And I think that for kids, having the dramatization, I mean, there's a reason that after-school specials look like that. It's to keep kids engaged. And I think that helped keep their attention, having that interspersed throughout. So, I mean, I guess that's the perspective I bring, that like, I get it. It's kind of lame looking, but for kids to even have the visual conception of what for the algorithm, like they can show a bank of computers and they do that, but to give like a face to it, I think is helpful.
Well, I think my biggest issue is I didn't mind the idea of the dramatization itself. I mean, and it was, for the most part, like well done, like it was well produced, well acted, you know. I think my issue was just how weird the content was, if that makes sense. So like the idea of when, for those who haven't seen it, to describe and illustrate what the algorithm is, they have 3 people that are kind of inside the phone. They're constantly doing things and talking about strategies that can get you to stay on the social media apps more. And it makes it look very evil and, you know, like maniacal and kind of twisted way of saying like, you know, oh, if we show him this, you know, tweet or something from like his ex-girlfriend, which I thought was hilarious. Like if we show a thing from his ex-girlfriend, he'll get back on social media again.
Right.
So like stuff like that. But then there was just stuff in it that just, it was almost like too nonsensical, and it kind of took me out of it as well, where, you know, like the idea of having the token, you know, voice of reason, where everyone's like kind of on their phones doing the things, except there was like the one daughter who's like, I am not on my phone, I don't do social media.
Yeah, like the Lisa Simpson of the family.
Very much so. And it's like, okay, man, like I get it. It's just, it looks so preachy, you know, again, like
Yeah,
very,
totally. No,
very
I
after
agree.
school. But then there's just other stuff where it's where it was just there was a part in it too where talking about face or social media addiction, things like that, where the mom decides to have like a nice family dinner without phones, and she puts everyone's phones in like this timed sweets container, and then they have like the youngest daughter go over to it when no one's like looking and like take a hammer to it and just smashes it to get her phone out. And this was like all in the span, at least as far as like the documentary time, of like 2 minutes.
Right.
And all I could think was, okay, I'm not a parent, and maybe you can shed some wisdom from your parenting experience. If one of my children destroyed one of my things after 2 minutes of being away from it, and I mean, she also like destroyed other people's phones in there too.
Right.
And then just walks away like nothing happened. My response wouldn't be, well, are you going to take care of that? Like, what was that? Like, I have never seen that ever happen before, and then have like a reaction so nonchalant, normal. Like, oh, you know, Denise is just doing her thing again.
Right. So for that scene, when we watched it with the family, one of the kids did say, wow, she really is addicted, or something along those
Right.
lines. So, I mean, it's a
Again,
a
it's like,
really short, concise way of getting a point across.
right. And it's like, I get it. I get why they're doing it. It just, a lot of it just seemed ridiculous to me. That was the only problem with it. And we'll get into some other fun stuff with the dramatization later, but we just had to talk about that first because some of it was just so ridiculous. So where would you want to start as far as the content? Like, maybe we should start like, what were the actual arguments being made?
So for me, I think a really important point is that these apps aren't free. Somebody has to be paying for these apps. And if you're not the one paying for the apps, it's being paid for by advertisers, which means that the app isn't the product. We're the product.
Right. And I really like that quote in there too, where, yeah, basically said, if you're not paying for it, you are the product. And that's kind of the thing I think people need to understand too. And maybe they do already, I'm not sure. But when I was in college and I was doing my various marketing classes and things like that, I remember my professor saying, okay, what's Facebook? And people were like, it's a social media site. He's like, No. What's Facebook? And they're like, it's a social platform. No. What's Facebook? And we just kept going down lines. I'm like, no, here's what Facebook is. Facebook is a marketing powerhouse that is perfectly designed to get all of your products to the people you need them most that you want to target. That's what Facebook is. If you think Facebook is anything other than a marketing powerhouse, you are wrong. And I really like that, and it kind of stuck with me ever since, where marketing for what is, it could be anything, right? Whether it's ideas or products or things like that too. And I think that's another thing to talk about, the idea of like when you're marketing something, it's not just like, hey, we're trying to sell you a new line of, I don't know, clothes or coffee or something like that, which I mean, they also do that too. But talking about an easy way to manipulate someone's world and to push ideas out there at such an extreme way that makes it easy for these ideas to spread is quite amazing and horrifying at the same time.
Right, but it's not really about any kind of evil intent. They're not trying to, press or push bad ideas like as the end goal. That's not what
Right.
what's driving it. There's not some kind of malicious intent. It's all about engagement.
Right. And
So you that Jaron Lanier, is that how you pronounce his name? Jaron Lanier, guy with the dreadlocks.
oh, yes.
I've been following him for years, and I really loved this quote, and I want to read it exactly. He says, "It's the gradual, slight, imperceptible change in your own behavior and perception that is the product." So they don't care which direction your perception is changed into. All they care is that you're engaged.
Right. And that's the idea of what the document calls the attention industry, right? Where
The attention economy.
the
Yep.
attention economy. Thank you. Yeah, where it's more so about just as long as you're engaged, they don't care where it is.
And the byproduct of that is that you are going to get bad ideas, because bad ideas keep you engaged better than truth or good ideas.
Right. Well, and I mean, and there's been various studies done on that where outraging content or things that outrage people is what goes viral the most, because usually fear and anger are what pushes people to do action.
Right.
I mean, and I think a really good example of that is, almost, as much as I hate to say it, look at almost any conservative movement where they just, even though they are the ones who usually talk about the outrage brigade the most, the idea of them getting triggered by something very small and having an entire movement based off of it is usually their entire political platform.
Well, that's what reactionary means, right?
Right. So, and this is also why right-wing Twitter is a real thing. This is why you see things like rabbit holes going to the alt-right, which is what we'll talk about later, is much more common than people going to, we'll say, hardcore radical left stuff. But what I do want to talk about is the idea of how well we can be manipulated. I mean, the documentary goes into like excruciating detail about various things that it does to, or that social media does to manipulate us to stay on more. And now this is like kind of my bread and butter. I love this stuff where they're talking about, a great example was Facebook sending you a notification saying that you're tagged in a photo.
Yeah.
Even though it's easier probably just to send you the photo, they're intentionally not doing so because they know that's what will get you on, because the idea of someone talking about you is a psychological pressure.
Right.
So I think that's kind of fascinating as well. They also talk about the idea of constantly swiping down to refresh your Facebook feed.
Like a slot machine, yeah.
Right, and they compare it to a slot machine where it's not the idea that you're always going to get something new, but when you do, it hits you with dopamine. You get something new and fascinating to look at.
Absolutely.
Which is what keeps you on.
I'm going to give you an example from this morning. I've been trying to use Facebook less. I'm trying to post less because I have really important things to say, but I'm holding them back because I know when I post them on Facebook, I'm distracted for the rest of the day trying to look and see who's responded to it, whether I'm getting likes. And so I went on Facebook, and there were no notifications because I hadn't posted anything. And I was going through my news a little bit, and then boom, the little red 1 showed up on the notification icon.
Yep.
And I felt it. I felt the dopamine. I felt it.
And you immediately went to go check.
And
like,
I
what is
quick
this?
touched it, even though I knew it couldn't be responding to anything I said, and it ended up just being, somebody posted in a forum that you follow.
Right.
It was nothing, but I still had the experience.
Right, and actually that's why I had to turn notifications for like groups off, because they would keep spamming my phone.
Yeah.
With
But
group
it
stuff.
did it while I was looking at it, because
Yes.
it knew that I'd been on the app, and it's
Yep.
like, oh, let's see if we can keep them on the app.
Yep. And I think this is also where we should be talking about the actual idea of freedom of choice. Now, we don't have to go into like the whole concept of free will here, right? But I think that's something that a lot of people aren't taking into consideration. The idea that we actually don't have this freedom of choice that we like to think we do. We like to think that we are complete independent beings who have the complete freedom to do whatever they want, and if they choose to not do something, they won't do it if they truly believe it. But that's not the case. That's not how we work.
It really isn't.
And I think this is yet another great argument to the testament of, we'll say, like causal determinism, or at least against the idea of free will. So what are your thoughts on actually breaking it down to that philosophical level, where it's just actually talking about the concept or the notion of free will in the context of Facebook and social media and stuff like that?
Yeah, so I've been thinking about that a lot. I call myself a compatibilist, but pretty much like I'm on board with determinism, but I also think that choice is meaningful, and so we want to have the experience of making choices, and we think that we're choosing to use social media. And I feel like a big part of the argument, or a big point behind this documentary, is to say we need to have regulations. And I feel like there is going to be a libertarian response that's going to say, no, you can't regulate this, because people have to have the right to choose how they're going to use social media. And it's a relationship between them and the social media companies, and no one else should get involved.
Right.
And they're not recognizing that the regulation is there to protect your free will.
Right. Well, I mean, they wouldn't recognize the regulations are there to protect us usually, right? I mean, the idea of, let's talk about like various regulations on like the FDA, or making sure we don't get swindled into buying, things that could possibly kill us. But right. And I think that's the biggest issue here. But when you're living in a highly individual society where this is basically embedded into our foundation of the country, right? Where we have the idea of the American dream. You can do whatever it is you want to do as long as you put your mind to it. That leads to a lot of problems, because we tend to ignore our own psychological pitfalls. And that's usually what leads us to get swindled very easily, unfortunately, and leads us to be persuaded. And coming from, I'm sure both you and I can relate to this, because talking about, undue influence, especially in our upbringings.
Yeah.
You don't have to be a stupid person to get persuaded by stuff like this. This isn't a dumb or smart thing. This is just what we all do as humans.
Exactly.
And we need to recognize that, so we can actually be at least a little bit more aware of how easily we can be taken over, psychologically speaking.
It's a different part of the brain. A mindfulness or awareness over what's happening to the way our brains are being hacked by these algorithms. It's not something that we automatically recognize.
Right.
Was it the documentary, or was it the Z-Dog video, where it's talking about doctors and lawyers and really smart people who can post really intelligent things on Facebook, but then are obviously being roped into it through this kind of like thousands of years of evolutionary programming that we have in our brain that's being harnessed by these social media companies.
Well, and that's why actually I really, really loved the comparison in the documentary to like magic tricks, where, if someone just goes off and believes like it's straight up magic that someone made a rabbit appear out of the hat or something like that, right? Then that's a different story. But just because you see a magician trick you by making something that seems ludicrous possible right before your eyes, that doesn't make you stupid.
Right.
All they did was just take advantage of your limitations as a human. When we talk about, cognitive blind spots, and the idea of that fun little experiment I always like to talk about, where people are counting how many passes there are in a video, but they miss the gorilla that walks through. I mean, they're not dumb, but it's just our own limitations as humans.
Exactly.
So if you're aware of that, I think that'll give you a much better we'll say, it'll give you more leverage when trying to figure out what decisions are best for you, at least as far as decisions go.
Right, exactly. A lot of time is spent in the documentary, especially the first half, talking about this being addictive. And I bristle a little bit at that word whenever we're talking about things that we need, that our species needs, whether it be sex, food, or, social contact. These are all like basic things on the hierarchy of needs. So to compare them to heroin.
Right. And that's the thing too. Like, they're not just comparing, like, or in the document, they're not just comparing social media to an addiction, but they're literally like having like jump cuts to like heroin needles and people getting ready to shoot themselves up.
Right. Exactly. And that feels a little unfair. I mean, I get why they're doing it. And it's kind of like this outrage, tapping into the whole outrage thing. They're doing it too.
Right.
But I guess I use the word compulsion when I'm talking about stuff like this, like sex addiction. Is there such a thing as sex addiction? I don't know, but certainly can become a compulsion for people.
Right. I think for me, at least, when it comes to the word addiction, I mean, if we're going to start diving down into like definitions, I don't have a problem with calling things addictions when it starts becoming an issue of what the person doesn't want, if that makes sense, or it starts harming the individual. I'm okay with calling that an addiction. So, like, for example, and I'm sure almost everyone agrees, like, you can have too much of a good thing at the end of the day, where even something as, I don't even know, like, we'll talk about, like, caffeine addictions, right? Where I think the idea of having some kind of, you have, like, a cup of coffee a day, or you have a soda every once in a while, but then when, like, all you drink is coffee or soda, and you can't even choose not to have that because you are so compulsory going towards that, and like your body's like almost like it's basically making you have it over and over again because you're almost going through like little tiny withdrawals.
Yeah, you have a physical dependency.
Right. I think that's where it's okay to call it an addiction. And I think you could make an argument that while I think it's a bit deceptive to compare to things like physical addictions, like heroin and things like that, I think you could definitely make an argument that social media is addictive and you can go too much into it. A good example, and this is totally anecdotal, is me, where I've had times where, and this is, whenever I catch myself in my own pitfalls, it blows my mind, and I kind of have to sit there and like talk about your own like dopamine hit where you notice that you experienced it,
Right.
Where I would like go on Facebook for a little bit because I'm bored, and then I would, okay, I'm done. And I'd switch it away. I'm like, now what do? I literally instinctively hit Facebook again.
I know. I've done it.
And that's what scared me, where it's like, and I've done that multiple times where I would open Facebook multiple times just because I knew that's where I'm supposed to be going. And it's complete compulsory. So is that an addiction? I don't know, but I think you could probably call it addictive to a point at least.
So with like heroin addiction, people that have been in it for a while, like they want out and they just can't stop.
Right.
And I don't know that a lot of people are self-aware enough to recognize that they don't really want this social media anymore. They're still really into it.
Yep.
So they're not having that, oh my God, I have a problem, but I can't stop experience. But I think that still is going on. We all long for connection. And this gives us a cheap version of that that's really easy to access. So we have this kind of path of least resistance where we feel like we're fulfilling that need, but then we're actually sacrificing real relationships. And I think that was actually portrayed pretty well in the documentary, even during the dramatizations. There was at one point where the main character and his friend were sitting on a bench together and they were engaging with each other at first. And then all of a sudden, a notification comes up on the phone and now they're both looking at their phones. Like that's a normal occurrence now.
Right.
And so people aren't even leaving their houses. Well, now we're in a pandemic. So it's
right.
like all of this stuff is amplified because of that. But, I know with our kids, like I wish they would ask, can we have a friend over more often? But it's like they have social media, so they're getting this feeling.
Why would they need to?
Exactly.
Per se? Yeah. Here's my issue with that type of, we'll say like singling out of social media though, is that people have been kind of saying that throughout time as well. I mean, I remember like back when like, MMORPGs were a big thing, like World of Warcraft and stuff like that, people were talking about that exact same problem, where it's like, why aren't you going outside? Well, because my friends are online. I don't need to. And I think that's okay. But again, I guess I just have to keep going back to, like, too much of a good thing can be bad.
Right. I think to some extent that's inevitable.
Yes.
And we just have to accept that the technology is changing. And, we're probably going to be having virtual reality conversations with people. And, like, all of that is just something we do have to accept to a certain extent. Like, I don't want to be the Luddite that says, oh, this technology is going to kill us. Like, people have been saying that about every advancement in technology ever. So the question is this one different? And in what way is this one different?
That was a big issue I had with the documentary too. I have the specific quote here where they were comparing the implementation of social media to, like, when bicycles were invented.
Yeah.
And he said, where is it? He called the bicycle a tool and basically said, when the bicycle was invented, no one said, oh my God, we just ruined society. Oh my God, we just crippled our democracy. And then he goes off to make how, like, that's because a bicycle is a tool. It's not demanding anything from you. But when something's not a tool, it demands things from you in return. It tries to influence you. It tries to pull things from you. And I said, okay, I have no problem with that. But that's because Facebook isn't just a tool. It's a part of entertainment as well. It's a part of it's a social tool as well, which I think is different from, like, a hammer.
Yeah.
Where, I mean, and here's the thing that really irritates me, whereas, yes, I think you can make the distinction that it is different today, where the idea of having algorithms that track, thousands of points of data on each and every one of us is different. And the multitude of that is something that we should be focusing on. I have no problem with that. But to only say that social media, or this, like, stuff only started happening, or to insinuate that this stuff only really started happening with social media, is ludicrous. They've said the exact same thing about TV, about radio. I mean, I know we kind of listened to something where they said, or they used to say the exact same thing about the Pony Express.
People would be addicted to writing letters.
Right, because no one would go outside, and because people would be literally addicted to writing each other back and forth instead. So I think the idea is, yes, this is different and we can focus on that. But to say that this just started happening, that was kind of a annoying thing that happened for me throughout the documentary, at least.
Yeah, no, I agree. And the bicycle comparison isn't really a fair one. I mean, it makes a point, but it's not a good analog. Like you said, there's been a lot of technological advances that are more similar. And you mentioned the data collection. I think that is pretty central to this, because it's getting to understand us on an individual level. I mean, you had feedback for, what's going to be on TV. Like, they had feedback loops looking at or focus groups, they would figure out what people like. And so that kind of thing has been happening for a long time.
Right.
How can we keep people engaged? I think what it makes this unique is that they can do that for each individual person and tailor it for them specifically.
Right, and I think that's kind of the big point with this too. And not only can it do that, but it also reach out to you to do that. Where, I saw that you kind of put down how you have to turn the TV on and off, or you have to turn the radio on and off to actually engage with it, where social media will just send you notifications to get your attention, which I think is a big difference. And then on top of that, the idea of having tailored content specifically for you is awesome, but frightening at the same time.
Absolutely. No, it's great to have your own tailored recommendations on YouTube. It's like, oh man, I found a lot of bands that I didn't know existed because of YouTube. That's great.
Right. But I did like their comparison from, like, Facebook or Google to, like, Wikipedia, where they said, imagine going to Wikipedia and you see the post of whatever it is you're looking up. But that's what everyone else is seeing. Now imagine trying to have a Wikipedia where if you look up, I don't know, we'll say roses or whatever it is, just because I happen to see roses in front of me, that the Wikipedia entries are different for each and every person.
Yeah.
That's scary to think about.
It's terrifying.
So, and that's exactly what happened. So, as far as Facebook goes, I don't think they try to really push that hard on Facebook. I don't think that's as much of a thing, because there's a lot of content that's driven by your own friends and family, which automatically will put you into some kind of bubble. But the idea of having, like, Google tailor your search results for this, where we are kind of treating Google as the basis of finding out information and knowing that people are typing in similar things and coming to completely different conclusions based on their search results, based on where they live or what interest they already had, is terrifying.
It is terrifying when it's happening outside of just pure entertainment. So like Netflix is another example. We have Netflix recommendations coming up, and it's like a lot of anime because that's what Zoe watches, and a lot of horror because that's what I watch. And I'm like, nobody else in my neighborhood are seeing these recommendations. I was talking to the kids about this yesterday. And that's great.
Yep.
Like we're getting, it's figuring out what we like. It's like Spotify or Pandora, or
right.
like, you know, or
more,
like I was saying about YouTube. If you're using it for entertainment, that can be really cool because it's figuring out your tastes and kind of even broadening your perspective a little bit. But when it comes to news, like I don't know if there's a place for that in news.
I mean, imagine again, like having Netflix as like your main source of information, and the only information you would ever get is from like Netflix documentaries.
Right.
And they just started pushing you further to like 9/11 truth or conspiracies, you know? So like that's a big deal. And this is where you see a lot of the issues come from when trying to regulate this type of stuff, where people are trying to say this stuff is really bad. Like Facebook and social media are pushing them to these various rabbit holes. And, you know, that's kind of where I wished they did put a nice little nod. I think at least in the dramatization, they put a little nod towards like the rabbit holes. I wish they talked about it more though from like a document, from more of like from a more informational perspective.
Yeah, no, a little more data driven.
Yes.
So in the documentary, you see this Tristan Harris on stage a number of times.
Yes.
I've watched that presentation on YouTube. It's on YouTube where you can see that whole thing, and he does get into a lot more details about stuff. One of the things that it mentioned, so Tristan Harris is featured. He's kind of the main talking head in the documentary, and they show him on stage and at a number of points throughout the documentary. And that program, you can find it on, or that presentation where he's on stage, you can find that on YouTube. And he does get into more data-driven stuff. I don't have any of it right now, but a couple, you know, it's definitely worth looking up and watching. But a couple that stood out to me were related to Flat Earth and Alex Jones, and how many times YouTube has recommended Alex Jones videos to people who weren't searching for Alex Jones videos.
Right.
And then the other one that was mentioned was, like I said, Flat Earth. And it talked about Google results for if you were to search Flat Earth, what percentage, I think this was in 2018, what percentage were positive, like flat Earth stuff. And then YouTube searches, what percentage? It was a little higher for pro Flat Earth stuff. But then when it went to recommendations for Flat Earth, it was like 80% were positive.
I liked the documentary's nod to the rabbit holes and stuff like this. I think they kind of sold themselves short because they're trying to stay politically neutral, which I think just...
right.
I mean,
I think extreme center.
Right. So, well, and as much as I hate to say, like, I thought it was actually a really funny little nod that they did that, where when they were trying to engage one of the main characters, which is like a high school teenage boy, after his girlfriend broke up with him or something like that, and how to get him back online, one of the little three men in the algorithm said, and I quote, "Going political with extreme center content has a 60% or 62% chance of engagement," which I thought was kind of, I mean, again, the idea of the extreme center is what they kept pushing because they didn't want to
alienate anybody. Yeah.
Right. But when you think about it, I really like the idea because that's where a lot of right-wing like rabbit holes start.
Absolutely.
Is the radical centrism.
Yep.
So like, oh my God, he's going to go full Jordan Peterson on me.
Right. And then they have Jonathan Hayden, who you know, I have mixed feelings about, but he's like you know, the extreme, like the real world centrists love Jonathan Haidt. So I thought that was a little bit ironic.
So, but yeah, I thought that was interesting, but I really wished they got into that more. Like they show the character going down the rabbit hole. Like they show like how slowly his stuff starts going from like his friends and family pictures and stuff like that to like political videos, to climate change denial videos, to flat earth videos and things like that. And I think they did that on purpose to show like how far this could spread. The problem is the way they depicted this was so kind of stupid and outlandish, where like the they had like a clip of some guy talking about how climate change was a hoax or something like that. And the way he was talking was so dumb. Like you could clearly tell like they just told him to talk like an idiot for like
Right.
for like 2 minutes. I'm like, they didn't show any of the intermittent steps to get there. And I think that's what really sucks. And we talked about this in our QAnon episode, but if you haven't already, check out the New York Times Rabbit Hole podcast.
So good.
It's so good. And while we focused on the QAnon episode, the last few episodes based on QAnon, the majority of that podcast is actually based on how YouTube's algorithm can actually push you towards right-wing content into like literal alt-rightism and even like Nazism and fascism and things like that too. So I wish they got into stuff like that because there is a lot of good data and a lot of studies done on stuff exactly like that.
Right.
So, but I get that they're trying to stay politically neutral. I don't know. I wish they focused more on the rabbit hole stuff because I think that's where it's really dangerous right now, at least.
Yeah, that's certainly my perception as well.
And then I don't know if you saw this, but in like his, again, I'm gonna bash the dramatization all day long, but so basically he had to make a deal with his mom to help fix his screen that his sister just broke with a hammer. And again, like we don't ever hear about that daughter again, really, like from a parenting perspective, but fine. But anyway, like, so the mom makes a deal saying, if you can put your phone down for a week and not go on it,
I'll pay to fix your screen.
I'll pay to fix your screen. So he tries to do it, and then eventually he gets back on and starts getting to more of this rabbit hole stuff and just falls deep into it. And he goes into like one of those binges of like social media stuff. But what I thought was hilarious is that the way they depict it is like one of those like rock bottom binges you'll see like in the old time movies where it's just like you see like the signs go up and he's just like drunkenly like walking from like sign to sign, and then at the end you just see like the guy laying in the gutter somewhere, you know, like just like it was the exact same thing but with social media where you just see him like binging all this crazy stuff and he's just going insane on all this like hardcore Facebook binging.
Right, like
and then,
this video montage of the alcohol bender that somebody goes on.
right, and it just shows him passed out in his bed with his phone. I'm like,
Right.
Great. No, nothing subtle about that.
So another thing in the documentary that we've kind of glossed over a little bit was the effect that it has on that social media has on kids. At least the claims that it makes about the effects of social media on kids.
And this is where I really wanted to get your opinion because you are a father. So I wanted to see, like, as someone, you know, who actually has children, how do you cope with stats like this?
So we try to put limits on screen time, and it is a constant struggle. I do agree with what Jonathan Haidt says at the end, that kids should just never have their phones overnight in the bedroom. That is a rule that we have. As far as no social media for kids until they're, what did he say, 16?
I think so, yeah.
We haven't done that. The kids are on Snapchat and TikTok and YouTube a lot. For the most part, they do see it as entertainment. I don't think they're getting a lot of news from it. Mm-hmm. With the two oldest, I think it's really good that they've watched this documentary now so that they can recognize the way social media works when it does come to news, and that it is something that you need to be really careful about.
Have you had the talk with your kids, and like how have they reacted to that talk of like having to limit what they're doing on social media?
They respond to it pretty well. I know we did face some challenges with Snapchat. We were really resistant with Snapchat, especially, you know, when the kids were younger. And we have put age limits on. It's like, no, you're too young for Snapchat. And then at some point, you know, we let it in. And there's some very real dangers with Snapchat that, you know, are kind of not really even within the realm of concerns addressed in this documentary.
Right. Well, they mostly talked about like Instagram and Facebook. Those were kind of the main ones they focused on in this documentary. My one issue, and we should talk about this for a little bit, is their 1-to-1 correlation between social media usage and things like anxiety and depression, things like that with young Americans, or young anyone. And there are real issues, at least with younger generations, that we are seeing a decline in, let's say, like more social types of behavior, more risk taking. There's a big decline in that, and then raised levels in depression and self-esteem issues and anxiety. But I think the idea to just say that's only because, or at least even to insinuate that it's only because of social media usage, I think was kind of disingenuous.
Yeah, correlation doesn't necessarily equal causation, as we
Right.
know. And we're fairly early in this social media experiment, 5-10 years into it.
Right.
So to
say the data is actually there is just not true yet.
Right, but to say that there's no connection feels obtuse to me. Like
No,
it's-
and I wouldn't say there is or I wouldn't say there isn't any connection. I think just the insinuation that like this is the connection.
Right.
There was a really good interview that we were listening to about this exact documentary, where they brought up a couple of studies or a couple of meta-analyses where, does social media lead to these types of high anxiety and depression in young Americans? And basically they were talking about how social media itself wasn't the actual issue. It's the things that are surrounding social media. For example, talking about having sleep deprivation because you were having your phone in your bedroom and you were just constantly scrolling through Facebook. So you were constantly getting less and less sleep. And that is what would definitely directly link to these types of feelings. So I think that's what we should be looking at as well. It's not just Facebook itself. It's not just the idea of talking about, posting your stuff on social media just causes anxiety by itself. It's the idea of encompassing everything around it that really, that's what should be the focus, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think you're right. On the other hand, there was a point made that I think is hard to argue against. And I wrote it down here. It says, I don't remember who said it, but it says, we didn't evolve to be aware of what 10,000 people think of us or to have social approval dosed to us every 5 minutes.
Right. And I mean, that's
And
where
that
you
seems
see
intuitively true.
Yes. And I mean, that's where you see that exact same issue with like celebrities, where you see lots of issues with addiction, like real drug addiction and stuff like that, and depression and anxiety with celebrities because they can't take it. Because it's hard. Like, it legitimately is very difficult to have all these people judge you all the time.
Yeah, it's not natural. I mean,
No.
this is a very recent thing that we've been able to have that kind of experience, even for celebrities. I mean,
Right.
This is all recent. And so I think that, this connection to anxiety and depression is real, and it's something that we should keep talking about, but be careful to not oversimplify.
Right, exactly. And here was another issue I had with the documentary and some of the analysis of the documentary too, where they talk about how social media is what is the cause of like our social discourse collapse. And yes, I like to agree that there is definite influence, just like we talked about with anxiety and depression. There definitely is a factor, right? But I think to blame social media for this, again, it's, I think, lazy and disingenuous. I would like to think, because at the end of the day, people weren't just having nice conversations about this stuff before social media happened. They just weren't having these conversations. And to say like, everything was nice and peaceful before social media came on. No, it wasn't. You just didn't hear about it.
Yeah, that's a valid point.
So when we're talking about, people are now like, they don't know how to have actual conversations now. They never did. And actually what you're seeing more is younger generations are actually better at having deep conversations than older generations. So while we should definitely get away from the idea of the Twitter own, right? Because the idea of like just destroying someone on Twitter with a sentence or something like that, which is stupid, but to actually have good logical discourse, which again, even then, text-based discourse is always bad to begin with. We can't just blame Facebook for the lack of nuance right now, because I truly don't believe it was ever actually there, personally.
Don't you think that social media rewards people for the, what you call the Twitter own, so people are inclined to engage in that way?
And that's where I think the issue is, where yes, we always had issues with conversing with people about these types of issues. However, the algorithms do definitely point us in that direction of making less discourse happen. And I think that's where we should be focusing on. Not just, again, it's the exact same thing with, we talk about the anxiety and depression again. We should definitely focus on it as a factor of what's going on, but not as the main factor or the only factor. And it goes back to like the other study we were talking about before, where the best tweets that go viral are the ones that kind of get us outraged, right?
Right.
So it totally sets us up for that type of like little tiny Twitter owns. I mean, look at any meme today. That's how political memes work. It's that little bit of, screw those guys and we're better in like a sentence. It's bumper sticker politics, but now all the time. I don't know how to change that. I mean, when I write anything on Facebook, anyone who knows me knows that I write a lot. So like when someone says something wrong, like in a sentence on Facebook, I'll end up writing like a novel in response just because I have to like get through every single point that they made. But I don't think it's about actually just blaming the face or the social media networks themselves is going to help us. I think it's about actually adapting and teaching us how to live with this type of interaction so we can use it for our better good.
I think you're right. I think that what we had before was a situation where nobody talked about religion and politics.
Right.
And so you had all this discord happening under the surface. And so you had this kind of absence of aggression that wasn't really peace. So you could have a conversation with somebody and it would be civil, but there would be this underlying difference of ideology. And so now with social media, we're able to have those conversations. We're more likely to have those conversations, which has a lot of negative effects, and it's keeping us up at night and making us really angry and outraged, et cetera, et cetera. But if we can harness that for good, now this stuff is out in the open, and we're going to try to have some logical conversations about it. That's great. The real problem, I think, is this whole fake news thing, that we're all in this bubble, and once our feed on Facebook or Twitter starts to tell us that everybody agrees with us, when we start encountering people who disagree, we can't handle it.
Right.
And I liked in the documentary, it said that once you think everybody agrees with you, you're easily manipulated.
Yep.
And there's no need for compromise if everyone is entitled to their own facts. So that seems to be the real problem, is that people are in these, our epistemology is not shared anymore. We're living in different realities. So now we're not really even having conversations about the real world.
Right.
So I like the idea of having conversations about the real world and how to make it better, and recognizing that there's people that disagree with you and addressing those differences. But if you're living completely different realities, you're not going to get anywhere.
Right. And the irony isn't lost on me here, but when you have what you posted, or something that you posted a while ago, which I really liked, was we're not living in a post-truth world. We're living in a post-trust world.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the real danger of this misinformation is coming from. It's not even just the fact that we are getting different facts, is that what people trust as sources aren't even remotely in the same field anymore.
Right.
And when you talk about having our most trusted sources, which are, our usual media outlets like AP and New York Times, NBC, ABC, NPR, BBC, whatever it is, having people say those are all bad because they don't agree with what I have to say. That is terrifying.
Yeah, I don't know how to respond to that.
Right. Because and this is one of the issues I've seen with a lot of people as well, where it's not the fact that when someone posts something that you don't like or that you know is wrong, it's very easy for you to tell, well, supposedly, unless you're the actual one who's in the wrong, but we'll say hypothetically you're not. It's very easy for you to tell that they're posting fake news or from a site that's probably dubious or something like that, right? How do you actually tell them that their entire trusted source of information is actually lying to them? And that's really hard, especially coming from our experiences with, both of us being in cults, where what do you do to actually show them that the entire way they think is incorrect?
Yeah. If we're talking about, kind of alt-right thinking or fringe right-wing stuff, they've been programmed to think that fact checkers can't be trusted.
Right.
PolitiFact can't be trusted. Snopes can't be trusted. Fact check can't be trusted. And so I don't even share those links anymore because that's the response I get. I don't know what to say to people.
Because they're just left-wing, bias machines.
Everything is controlled by the left wing.
Right.
Then maybe it's controlled by the Jews.
Right. But that's the issue. Is like when you just have unfalsifiable, conspiracies all the time, you can make reality whatever you want it to.
Yeah, it becomes this self-sealing argument that any time you bring up a counterpoint, that all actually reinforces their belief system because that person's in on it too.
Right. And that's, just on an individual level. Let's look at like much mass scale, where you have gigantic disinformation campaigns, where you have what Trump is doing and his administration is doing right now, or even things like Brexit, where the whole idea behind Brexit was a focused misinformation campaign. So you have stuff like that as well. And those are just from like gigantic companies who specialize in this type of information or in this type of influence, right? But even worse is that you have like governments taking control and stuff like this, where you have like Russia, who is actually using information and disinformation as like war tactics.
Right.
And that's horrifying, where you have, what was it, in Myanmar, where they're talking about using, was it Facebook in Myanmar? I think it was Facebook.
Yep.
Yeah, in Myanmar, where they're talking about doing like mass genocide of various groups of people because of what they're seeing on Facebook. And like, that's really scary. So in places like in the US, where it's just a wild, wild west of, information right now, and it's just almost complete anarchy, you actually have concerted efforts in other countries that are using it to completely control and manipulate and make it like a very 1984-esque situation over there. And that I have no idea how to combat.
Well, that's the question. What's the solution to all this?
Well, according to the documentary, it's turn off Facebook notifications. You'll be fine.
So I'm glad that they did list off some things that we can do to make our own life a little better. But
Right.
it's kind of like, recycle.
I was going to
Or-
say, it's exactly recycling when talking about climate change.
Right. Yeah, those are things that are nice and makes you feel good. And I guess this is a little bit different than things we're doing to affect the environment, because this will actually improve our personal well-being. And so, like, for me, that feels meaningful and important. But I also recognize that starting a campaign to tell everybody to turn their notifications off isn't going to change these systems. We have to do something to address the motive. And, of course, the motive is profit.
Correct. And they kind of went into that a little bit with the documentary, where they had some Senate hearings, right? But I mean, that's the other big problem too, is like when you have people in Congress who have no idea how this stuff works, we're not going to get any of the change we need. I mean, I'm going back to like when you had, oh God, what's the Google CEO? I can't remember his name. It doesn't matter. We had the Google CEO come in, and the guy was asking him, why does my iPhone work correctly? And it's like, because we don't make the iPhone, or trying to figure out like, well, why is Google showing us that, Steve King is a racist on Google? Like, they have absolutely no idea how these things work, because they don't even know how, basic technology works. But I remember listening to a talk with the YouTube CEO where she was talking about going into a Senate hearing with stuff like this, and most of the people on there, I think they didn't even have smartphones. So they had no clue about how this stuff worked. Or they had to teach, she had to teach them how basic functions of YouTube worked. Not even just like the algorithm or anything like that, but just the idea of like, here's how YouTube works as a search engine, things like that, And that's really scary too, because now you have people who are leading us who are completely blind to the situation.
Right. So again, I'm glad this stuff is coming to the light. I'm glad that they're having Senate hearings. But as far as like policy, we touched on this a little bit earlier in our conversation. But the thing that makes social media different than older media is the level of data collection. And so I think the idea of de-incentivizing data collection is really important.
Yeah, like maybe doing something along the lines of like taxing the data, right? Or taxing
Exactly.
excessive data collection or things like that. There was one that said we should completely outlaw this market in the documentary, which that ain't happening.
No,
like
never.
Good luck with that. Even with all this bad stuff happening, I think you can have it with regulation. Even though I think cigarettes are very bad and there really isn't any positive side to cigarettes, if someone really wants to smoke them, as long as they have all the information they need to the best of our ability, okay.
Yeah, but then you remember when they outlawed Joe Cool
right.
from Camel cigarettes? Like, that was important. 'Cause
Right.
that was designed to attract kids, and that's not okay.
Right, exactly. And that's what we need to do here. We need to treat it just like anything else and have strict regulations on it. Otherwise, we're going to continue to live in the Wild West of information.
Right. And we are going to have a civil war.
Right.
I'm 50-50 on that. Like, I feel like it's coming, and this is a big contributing factor. So, yeah, let's address it.
Right. When you have people who are completely in different realities, this is what happens, where not only do you think your neighbor is wrong, you think they're morally corrupt
They're
in
evil.
some way.
Yeah.
Right. So this stuff has to get done sooner rather than later before an actual thing like a civil war could happen, which it very well could, for all we know. Like, Trump may not leave the office.
Yep, that could be it.
Yeah, I think that's all we had. So Yeah, this was a fun conversation. I'm glad we did, and we'll find the next fun documentary to look at.
Yeah, and next time that you fire Jason out of a cannon, give me a call.
We'll do. But Dan, I really do appreciate it. Thank you so much for coming on for us today.
It's been my pleasure.
Thank you again for listening to Think Progressively. You can find us on social media. No, we don't see any irony in that. On Facebook and Twitter at ThinkProPod. If you'd like to send us an email, you can check us out at thinkpropod@gmail.com. If you want to do us a favor and rate us 5 stars on iTunes and anywhere else you may be listening to this podcast, we'd really appreciate it. So please do that too. Otherwise, when in doubt, think progressively. Maybe get some clips out of her. Who knows? I'll piss some people off. But so, Jason.
Try again.
Oh, God.
There's one for the outtakes.
Cognitive dissonance when it comes to things like this because people were...
Oh, sorry. You don't need to give that a minute.
They're trying to suppress the truth.
They have taken over the ice maker.